Now, isn't it great that we live in a time where we can order just about anything online? We can order a camera, or baggy pants, or lollipops, or a green screen. But it's not really all that great if we can order these things but not get them. So there's got to be some way, some sort of transport system, some sort of transport means that gets those things to where they need to be, in this case to us. Now, we've talked about the digestive system and we've talked about the respiratory system, and we understand that with the digestive system the idea is to break down nutrients, and with the respiratory system we are trying to bring in oxygen and we are trying to expel waste, carbon dioxide. And we need to do that, but we need a means of getting all of these things from one place to the other. That is, we need, within the body, a transport system. And that's where the circulatory system comes in. You see, in smaller organisms, single-celled organisms, some multi-celled organisms, they're in direct contact with their environment. So any waste that they produce, or any nutrients that they need, or any oxygen that they need to acquire, they can just diffuse into it and out of their individual body cells. However, when we start to get larger and more complex, we can't interact immediately with our environment. We can't expel waste immediately into the environment, nor can we acquire oxygen immediately from the environment. We have to bring it to a particular surface or a particular area with the body, and then it has to be transported somewhere where it's needed. So in some simple organisms that are large enough to require some means of transport, there's what we call an open circulatory system. This open circulatory system has something called hemolymph, which is really just sort of a connective tissue, and it kind of bathes all of the other cells and allows oxygen to diffuse in and carbon dioxide to diffuse out, and allows nutrients to get from one place to another. But this is really only effective for smaller organisms. In fact, some smaller organisms that have open circulatory systems even have additional means of transporting gases around as well. But as we get more complex, as we get larger organisms that require more efficient means and more effective means of exchanging gases, of moving nutrients, of providing energy to cells, we have to have something called a closed circulatory system. And a closed circulatory system is a complex network of all of these different types of blood vessels that move these nutrients to and from the places that they need to be in the body, and to and from the external environment, as the case may be. So in fact, as we increase in complexity with these transport systems, not only do we move from an open system to a closed system, but we start to see more progressive complexity in these closed systems. It gets to the point where we start to have separate loops or distinct circuits that our medium starts to follow. And regardless of the type of organism, at least with animals, there are three main characteristics of a transport system that we are going to analyze. The first is that the transport system has to have some kind of medium, some kind of fluid that's going to carry these particular components, the wastes and the nutrients, from one location to another. And there has to be some type of pathway, some type of vessels that this medium can flow through. And third and finally, there's got to be a pump, a means by which we can move the fluid through these vessels. Now, we're going to take a look at all three of these things, and certainly as they relate to the human circulatory system, our transport system. But the first thing that we're going to focus on, and the focus of the remainder of this video, is on the fluid medium itself, and that is, of course, the blood. So right now, you've got about 5 or 6 liters of blood in your body. Blood is what we classify as a connective tissue. Part of that being because embryologically it derives from the same source as other connective tissues, but also because it helps connect one system to another. Now, that blood, I think we understand from a very young age, is extremely important for our survival. That is, we need blood to survive. So it must hold a very important set of functions within the body. And it certainly does. It has many functions. But I think for the sake of this video, we are going to categorize them into 3 major functions. One is transportation, another is protection, and another is regulation. And before we go into each one of those, I think it's important to take a look at what blood is actually composed of, so that we can say what components there are and what role they play in each of those 3 main functions. So you may have heard of, let's say in terms of donating blood, that blood has different components, that you can donate whole blood or you could just donate plasma. And if we were to take a sample of blood and put it into a vial and then move it into something called a centrifuge, which is something that's going to spin really quickly, and separate the blood into its various components based on the different densities, you might get something that looks like this. Now this is separating the blood into its 2 major components, one being the fluid portion of the blood and the other one being the cellular portion of the blood. So the first component of blood that we're going to take a look at is that top layer or liquid layer, what we refer to as the plasma. Now, not surprisingly, the plasma is mostly water. It's about 90% water, but as we can tell by the coloration of it, it's not all water. There are some dissolved materials within it. Within the plasma itself, there are a number of proteins that are dissolved in there, there are minerals dissolved in there, there are hormones that are being transported from one place of the body to the other. So the plasma itself is involved in a couple of those general categories of the blood in terms of their function, and one of those would be the regulation. In fact, plasma plays an important role in regulation of a number of things within the body. One of those things being temperature, and we're going to talk about that in conjunction with the blood vessels when we get there. It helps in terms of the regulation of hormonal control from transporting hormones from one place to another. It helps in terms of the osmoregulation or the blood volume that we have, because one of the proteins that are in there, the albumin, in addition to some of the other dissolved minerals, help dictate or determine how much water is being retained by the blood or released into the tissues in order to, again, control the blood volume that we have in there. In addition, there are some proteins in there that are involved in the immune response. For example, we have immunoglobulins that, in conjunction with some of the white blood cells that we're going to talk about, are involved in identifying and destroying pathogens or invaders into our body. We have fibrinogen, which is involved in the clotting response. So plasma itself, even though we generally tend to focus on the cellular components of blood, plays an extremely important role, not only in the regulation of the body, but also in protection of the body as well. And certainly within transportation of things like minerals and nutrients and fluids as we get from one area to the body, and the fluid by which the blood cells are transported from one place to another. So plasma for us ticks all three of those boxes. Now, as I've said already, even though plasma is an extremely important component of the blood, it's the cellular component that gets the most attention. And there are three main blood cells that we are going to focus on. The first one is red blood cell erythrocytes. We have the second type, which is the white blood cell or leukocytes. And then finally, we're going to discuss the platelets and their role within the body. So this first blood cell that we're going to talk about is probably the one that we associate most with blood, and those are the erythrocytes, or red blood cells. And it's not surprising, they give blood its red color, and they are by far the most numerous blood cell that we have in the body. Now, when we take a look at the function of those, I think most people understand that those red blood cells transport oxygen to the tissues from the respiratory surface. And these blood cells, if we look at them, are ideally suited to do that. You see, this representation of the blood cell indicates that it's a biconcave disc, meaning that it is a disc like this that's kind of been pushed in. And what that does is it maximizes the surface area for oxygen to diffuse in and out. In addition to that, as these red blood cells mature, their nucleus degenerates or breaks down. And what that does is it increases the volume, the carrying capacity, the ability of this oxygen to be carried within the red blood cell. So the more area outside allows for greater diffusion across, and more volume inside allows for more oxygen to be carried on the hemoglobin complex within these individual red blood cells. So the structure of the red blood cell relates directly to its function of being able to maximize the amount of oxygen that it can carry from the lung system to the tissues and the cells that ultimately need it. So while it's fairly obvious that the red blood cells are involved in the transportation function of the blood, it's the white blood cells that are involved primarily in the protection function of the blood. And while the red blood cells are by far the most numerous, the white blood cells have the most numerous types. And I'm not going to go into all of the different types and functions of the specific white blood cells, but it is important to know that in conjunction with the immunoglobulins that are present in the plasma, the white blood cells are there to identify, break down, and dispose of the materials that are generated when a foreign pathogen invades the body. So the last type of blood cell that we're going to talk about are the platelets. So the platelets are involved in the clotting response. That is, when a blood vessel ruptures or breaks, it's the platelets that are signaled to that break of the vessel. They change their shape a little bit and they start to join with the collagen that is present within the blood vessels themselves, and they start to form a network, and they combine with fibrinogen and activate it to form something called fibrin, which ultimately closes up the clot and allows the body to start repairing that blood vessel underneath. So yes, we associate blood most with transport. That is, the transport of oxygen and carbohydrates to those cells so that they can use it for cellular respiration to remove the carbon dioxide that's a waste product of that same cellular respiration process, to move minerals and nutrients that are absorbed by the digestive system to those tissues that need them to grow and repair. But also, hopefully after watching this video, you understand that there is a very important regulation component of the body and a very important protection component that it serves for the body as well. So that covers the blood. But we still have to think about, how does the blood get from place to place? That is, what about those transport vessels it needs? And how do we move it around the body? That is, the pump. Well, we're going to get to those. Thanks for watching.